On va être bref sur les présentations.
Great. Now that we've had this general introduction on the issue at hand, I would like us to look at the details of the situation in France. We will talk about figures, we will talk about how things are on the field, and so this session was branded or called "Is there a specifically French problem?" Our first participant is Nathalie Coste. She is a history professor, and she teaches at the Saint-Exupéry High School. And actually, they've just gotten back with her class from a trip from Russia. So we'd like to thank you for being here. She will be leaving us this afternoon because she has to teach a class in Sciences Po in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. She's also a teacher there. I will give you the floor right now so that you can tell us about how you address these different issues and the Israeli-Palestinian issue with your class. Good morning, everyone. And yes, my apologies. I will have to leave before the end of the conference so that I can be on time for my class this afternoon. I think that first I'd like to start from explaining my point of view as a teacher. Secondly, I will explain why I'm giving you my experience. I will tell you what I was able to observe with regards to national education in France. And of course, I will not be speaking in the name of all professors of history and geography in France. I would just like to remind you that, of course, as a historian, our objective is not to criticize or oppose the Israeli policies. That's not what this is about, what our class is about. However, it is a theme that we need to present to our students, especially in the framework of official programs. Now, there is an order to address these sensitive issues. They're considered as sensitive issues in national programs, in national curriculums in high school and middle school. I personally treat the Israeli-Palestinian issue within the more general and broader theme of the Middle East. I will give you my experience as a professor in a difficult high school. I've been teaching there for 3 years, and I will tell you about the feedback that I've gotten. And with other colleagues, we have, by the way, organized a few demonstrations against racism, whether on the Israel-Palestine issue, but also on the genocide and the Holocaust. Once again, I do not want to be presumptuous and speak in the name of all professors and all teachers. I know that in middle school things are a bit difficult and different, and I know that in our region, in our suburban region or other suburban regions, it is more difficult than where I am. I think it's very important to have this feedback, and I would like to seize the opportunity that is given to me here to tell you how devastated we are when we look at how the media talks about these issues and how the media says that our students don't care about the Holocaust anymore, that our teenagers are enemies of the state, and that they're probably anti-Semitic. I have to say that when I see and hear this, this is clearly an exaggeration. It is erroneous, mostly. I can't tell you that there is no manifestation of anti-Semitism. I am not being naive here. But I have to say that this is highly romanticized. It is the stigma attached to the suburbs in France. and the youth in the suburbs are perceived as dangerous, and they end up being perceived as such by teachers who are not used to working with these young people. And they end up, for some of them, actually adopting and embracing this representation because it's sort of as if they were being assigned an identity. This ultimately only makes teenager mistakes even more serious and ingrains them. And I wanted to seize the opportunity here so that I could really convey our anger as teachers because our work is actually hindered by this erroneous image given of these young people in the suburbs. I would say that there is no poll or survey which confirms anti-Semitism in the youth of our suburbs. I've been teaching for 33 years, and I have never heard or witnessed such a thing in my classes. Now, of course, my colleagues do teach about the Holocaust, and one couldn't even imagine that they wouldn't. Many of our students are of Muslim confession, and contrary to popular belief, they are educated within their families in respecting the religion and their faith and everybody else's faith. And in fact, all of our students are just like any other students in France. They want universal peace on earth. And maybe that we were the same when we were younger, and they are teenagers. So, of course, it means that they need to be listened to before we talk to them, and we should also refrain from speaking in their name. And I have to say that the media don't do that at all. Now, another thing that is true is that many students don't know anything about this conflict and about this issue, but are very curious about it. And I will tell you more about it later on. Many of our students do have a specific inclination towards the Palestinian, empathy that they feel for the Palestinian side. Well, there's the religious thing, but also, of course, the romanticized version of the Palestinians as victims. But just as during history, we've had this form of empathy for victim peoples. Now, of course, this is fueled by TV channels that they watch. And sometimes there is a convergence because it does resonate with them on a certain level as they consider themselves or sometimes feel as victims in France. So, of course, these bridges do exist between these two situations, their own situation and Palestinian situation. And Palestinians, for them, are the people that were abandoned by the Arab governments. And, of course, this says a lot to them about their heritage and their countries of origin. Now, they also have interrogations about the importance given to the Holocaust in the curriculums. Now, a teenager in France has studied many times, and that's a very good thing, about the Holocaust. But what about the Khmer genocide or the Armenian genocide? We barely talk about it. The Rwandan genocide, well, is barely mentioned. So, yes, teenagers do wonder about this over-representation. This does not mean that they are adopting a revisionist position. No, it is a legitimate question that they are posing. So they do feel like there's a double standard. Pascal Boniface was talking about it before. And this double standard is not necessarily fueling anger. I think it's just confusing for these students. They wonder a lot about impunity on the international level, and this is something that we see a lot in their questions. Why is nothing done against the state of Israel? And maybe this is just, teenage angst, but of course they wonder why. Why is international law not applied? And this, of course, can fuel some form of conspiracy theories. When you don't explain things, of course, this can lead to them, teenagers, looking for these answers by themselves. They use social networks. They can be influenced by other things and go along a slippery slope. So I would say, however, that this is a trend which is not as strong as we would think. They actually tell us about their questions. They go to their history teacher, if they trust them, and they ask their questions about all of these different issues. Now, as a conclusion, I would like to talk about what we do. And I would like to say that I see these questions also in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is an entirely different area with a different population and different backgrounds. So this is just to show that it's quite debatable to set differences between teenagers coming from different parts or different types of suburbs or different social categories. We, as teachers, want to do our job. We have a scientific discipline. We set the scene historically. We give a political definition of the conflict. We are very careful with the words that we use. We are very thorough and meticulous when it comes to defining the concepts. What is a genocide? What is an ethnocide? What is a Jew? What is an Israeli? What is a Palestinian? What is a Zionist? So what we do is really try to define things thoroughly. We try to be very patient. Of course, we strongly oppose any type of abusive language, and this is very rare, as I said. And we also organize conferences, meetings, and these events are very important for our students, and I'll give you a couple of examples. We used to invite Eva Graspon, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, and she came to meet our students. And in Mantes-la-Jolie, in this region, in this suburb, there was a rap song actually written by the youth of the neighborhood as a tribute, as a homage to this woman. And she was very moved by it. And we also had another meeting with women from Israel during a week that we organized against racism. And I have to say that our students were completely impressed and admirative with this group of women. So thank you, please. Thank you for listening to me, and please do convey our message beyond. Thank you. Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you for your contribution. This was very concrete. And you stayed within your time limits. And I'm sure that Isabelle will do exactly the same thing. I am not going to be introducing her. I think everyone here knows who Isabelle is. And she will be giving us her perspective as a historian and as a journalist. She promised that she was not going to give us a blizzard of figures, but she was just going to give us a few figures to make things clearer. Isabelle, you have the floor. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Sometimes certain events confirm trends. From the 13th to the 16th of March, there will be the Festival of Israeli Cinema, and there will be a movie in particular which will be shown. And in this movie, violations, even though they are not shown as such, by the military in Israeli military are shown. And afterwards, a bulldozer actually hides whatever trace is left of these violations. And apparently this movie is quite controversial in Israel. The Minister of Culture, Regev, refuses for such a film to be exhibited and shown. And the Embassy of Israel in France has decided to boycott this festival in Paris. So this is the Festival of Israeli Cinema in Paris. And on Facebook, Taufik Tahani asked the following question. Will the Israeli embassy be condemned and brought to justice for boycotting this event, which should be an anti-Semitic act? Now, before I tackle a few issues, I would like to really pay tribute to the work that was done by the UJFP, and we saw the video before. This is an organization struggling against racism, and this is an organization which published a book on Jewish voices for peace and against racism. And we also owe them an event on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and I would really encourage you to go look at the video clips that they have posted on their website. Very few media have shared these videos or spoken about them, which is a shame, really. Now, let's talk about the question at hand. What can we say about this specific form of racism in France? Now, figures don't always say everything, but they do give us a few trends, and I would like to give you a few figures. Not figures from polls, random polls in the street. No, I would like to give you more rigorous figures given out by the National Council on Human Rights in France, respected institution. Now, these figures give us an idea of how racism manifests itself in France. Firstly, I would like to remind you that the word anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism was established by racists. And of course, this is a form of racism directed against the Jewish community. Now, let's look at the figures. There is a reality. There have been anti-Semitic acts, and it has led to murder. This is a first for France since the Second World War. And this is also a first, and especially if you consider what happened in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when Arab individuals were killed. And now I would like to give the example of the massacre of Toulouse in 2002, what happened in the supermarket of Hyper Kosher in 2015. There was the machete assault against a teacher in Marseille in 2016. So there is an intensification, which is telling about anti-Semitism in France. On the other hand, and I think that it is also important for it to be highlighted, what this institution says is that these actions are losing ground, whether anti-Semitic acts, but also assaults against Muslim people. And this is a new category in the statistics of this institution, but we could say since 2014. Okay, so it's only been 4 years, but in 2016, there was a decrease of 58.8% of these violent acts against the Jewish community. And for acts against Muslims, it is around 57%. But of course, this still represents a few hundred assaults against Jewish people or Muslim people in France. Now, at the French National Human Rights Commission, there is an increase of what they call the tolerance index. There seems to be, as I said, a strengthening of tolerance. I don't really like this word, tolerance, because there's a distinction of tolerating the other and distinguishing between us and them, but this is what they use. They use a tolerance index, and it seems to be increasing. Now, in this context, in this broad context, the Jewish community in France is the second community which is most accepted. And once again, I have to say this with air quotes because I'm not a big fan of this acceptance word. The acts of violence committed by this ultra minority are not correlated with racism and how it evolves in society. There seems to be a distinction between these two things. These acts are committed by a minority that is very well known, and racism in society is a different trend. So these two realities need to be distinguished. In France, the Jewish community and the Black community are the two most accepted communities. Still, it means 19% of the population does not accept these communities, which is a very high number. Now, for Muslims, we've passed from 46% to 63% for the tolerance index in 2016. When it comes to the struggle against racism, and I think it's important to recall this, especially when we look at the fears that are developing within our societies and the fears in certain communities, even if one can belong to a community in very diverse manners, 64% of the French population think that we must strongly tackle anti-Semitism, but also discriminatory attitudes against Arabs and Islamophobia. But what are the stereotypes for these different groups in France? For Jewish people, these are stereotypes that are ingrained in European anti-Semitism traditionally. Power and money, basically. These are the two stereotypes that are associated with the Jewish community. Now, when it comes to Muslims, 80% of the French population think that they are French, just like anyone else. However, 40% of the French population consider that they are a threat to our society. 40%. Now, of course, this is linked to the public discourse and rhetoric of the authorities on Islam, on security, on immigration, and all of the generalizations that are made on terrorism. And of course, this creates a confusion and leads to these opinions within our society. Now, the defenders of the Israeli policy say there is a correlation between the criticism of Israeli policies, and anti-Semitism. So, of course, there is a philosophy underlying the state of Israel, but currently what is being judged is the policy which is applied by the state. So how does this correlation between the criticism against the state and anti-Semitism work? I think we need to remind two important things. Firstly, the most important stereotypes associated with the Jewish community, and they are ingrained in our culture and society, are power and money. And now I would like to quote Ms. Meyer, a researcher at the French CNRS. She currently works also for the French National Human Rights Commission. She said that the survey does confirm that there is the existence or the birth of a new form of anti-Semitism. However, it is the result of a minority. Now, of course, we must tackle and fight against this. Now, for the traditional type of anti-Semitism, which is quite massive in France, the French National Human Rights Commission describes the people who have these opinions as being right-wing and quite overtly racist. However, we also have a strong presence of people aged under 50, people who have a degree. And we do notice that the more educated you are, the less you would be inclined to adopt and embrace these far-right theories. But it seems that the survey, which was published by the French National Human Rights Commission, invalidates this point. Unfortunately, Isabelle Avran is reading out excerpts of a document published by the French National Human Rights Commission, which is impossible to interpret for us. Our apologies. It seems that, contrary to popular belief, there is a rejection by groups of youth that are being accused of being anti-Semitic, of anti-Semitic acts and messages. So I would say that the facts really shed light on the reality. I would also say that those who link anti-Semitism with the fight against the state of Israel are not only wrong, they are also dangerous because they hinder our struggle against anti-Semitism within our own society. Now, why is the solidarity movement, why do we want to really be able to name and shame usurpers from the far right who use the issue of Palestine, notably on internet, in order to express their anti-Semitic hate and their hate of the Jewish community? They're also anti-globalization, by the way. They are also anti-immigration. They have a vision of the world which is strongly influenced by conspiracy theories. We have to fight against this. The enemies of our enemies are not our friends. They are not our allies, and we have to be clear about this. And sometimes they are even more our enemies than our actual enemies are. The solidarity movement must continue to name and shame all of these forms of abuse, because the movement of solidarity with the Palestinian people has values which are equality of rights, the fight against racism, all forms of racism, and refusing any type of discrimination on ethnic or religious grounds. And now I am going to quote Ilan Alevi, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Isabelle Avran is reading out loud a quote of Ivan Levy. Anti-Semitism and its violence actually continues to fuel the hegemony and domination of Zionism. It also fuels impunity, the impunity of the acts of the Israeli state. And I think that our friend Ilan had already seen the danger of accepting anti-Semitic abuse or drifts within our movement. Refusing to integrate the Jewish community in Europe is what created Zionism, and it's not the other way around, and we have to remember this. Now, thirdly, there is a generalization according to which criticizing Israeli policy and anti-Semitism. And I would like to ask the following question. How is this not only unacceptable, but also dangerous? And once again, this is about whether we are winning or losing and what our struggle is about. This is a debate which is long-standing, and this generalization exists since a very long time. But this is a rhetoric. The generalization is increasingly strong as BDS is collecting successes. BDS has started organizing its campaign since 2004, calling for boycott of cultural, political, economic institutions which support occupation and colonialism. That's for boycott. Then for divestment of firms who partake in occupation, and sanctions against the impunity which the state of Israel enjoys. Now, this citizen fight has started to bear its fruits. Now, of course, this is quite complicated because it is citizens against states, but nowadays Israeli executives consider this to be a threat, an actual strategic threat. And I think that this is quite important. And this is why we have to face this offensive of Israeli officials who want to completely legitimize the state of Israel, even when they are borderline extreme far-right wing. And this is why they also want to delegitimize the BDS campaign. This is a very serious matter, especially in the way that it resonates in France. And on top of that, there is also the will by the Israeli state to make this a religious conflict when it's actually an occupation conflict. There's also a generalization according to which resistance and terrorism are put together in the same category. Now, of course, this strategy is logical. It's fear-mongering And that way you have members of the Jewish community leaving from Europe to Israel. And it's also that way that Israel presents itself as a strong democracy fighting for democracy and for Western democracy in the Middle East. And these methods are, of course, legitimized and even shared with our Western authorities. This is, of course, very serious. Let's imagine one instant what the CRIF says. The CRIF says that all the Jewish community in France supports the Israeli policies. Imagine that we actually believe that these two things are the same. And if we were to believe them, and if we were to believe that anti-Zionism means anti-Semitism, well, what would that mean? What would that imply for those who don't have a completely thorough political construction? Well, this leads to peaks of violence against the Jewish community from a few individuals, and thank goodness that there are only a few. And this also leads to surges of violence in Palestine and Israel. Esther Ben-Bassa talked about the Second Intifada, but I would actually remind you that these peaks of violence, they came up after the repression against the Second Intifada. And finally, I would say that if we fight against impunity, this is the best antidote against all possible forms of racism. Why? Because we get rid of these identitarian and confessional constructions. Also, because it reminds us what the international law requires. It gives us a horizon and a perspective which enables us to fight on a level playing field. And I would say that BDS is part of this antidote and of our weapons. Of course, we will talk about this again this afternoon, but especially since we are talking about an issue that has been long-running for many generations now, evictions and killings and so on and so forth. This is also necessary for Israeli officials in order to change the course. It is also an antidote for our society. It is also an antidote in order for people to want to build a future together, so that the promise in our slogan in France, equality, freedom, and fraternity, be a reality and not simply something that we write on our school walls. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle, pour.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for all this information and the schedule, and you were right on track. So now I'll give the floor to Rony Brauman. His objective will be to wrap up this conversation when we took up two different perspectives, so that you can react to all that has been said with your experience and analysis. We've already had many occasions to read your analysis. So thank you. I'll be brief so that we'll have time to discuss, because I see that the papers are circulating in the room, and it would be really a shame if we could not have the time to discuss, and if this conference turned into just a lecture. So these two contributions and the first and the ones before are incredibly good. They are very precise and allow for a correction of the representation that can be sometimes full of errors. I remember that a few years back I had been invited to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a French radio station, LCI, and I have been surprised because I was presented by the show facilitator as an anti-Zionist Jew. That was really surprising for me. I did not really react well, and I still regret it today. But I know that many people are always taking the floor as Zionist and pro-Israeli in France, and they are never presented as Zionist Jews in France. So once again, this presentation was not really critics towards me. It was just this radio animator was just presenting myself as an anti-Zionist Jew. That was important for him, and Dominique Vidal reminded us that anti-Zionism is first of all a Jew movement, and I'm part of that movement, just like many other of the Jewish community. But to me, it is very useful to put things into a context again. When I think about the title of our roundtable, is there a specific French problem? Esther Benbassa this morning said that, yes, we have specific French problems. I'm not sure we would need to analyze the situation in the UK, in Germany, in many countries. I'm not able to answer that question, but maybe, and that we can say that there is a specificity in France, and maybe that's what she had in mind. First, because we are a specific nation, but also because in our history, France was the first country to have emancipated the Jewish community, and that's something big. Then there is the revolution, of course, and the fate of the Jewish community became a symbol of the Republic in France. Many Jews, and when I say Jews, I should say Zionist Jews, are using this notion to become themselves the Republic. And even though it is clear that there is nothing more further away from the Republican ideals as the Israeli ethnocracy today. So the fact that they use that status as Jew to say that they are a symbol of the Republic is a problem, and but this is something we've seen again and again. The Dreyfus case reminded me of that, and also after when we rebuilt our society, as Gilles Manson mentioned before, the Dreyfus case was used, even though the Israel project was already in the mine, in the pipeline, so to say. And then the Algerian question seems to be replayed there. And I also want to remind you all that in the 50s, that was the time when France supported Israel in its fullest until the Six-Day War in 1967. France was to Israel what the United States has become for Israel afterwards. Even though the French leaders, at the time, the SFIO, the Socialist Party at the time, was a staunch supporter of the Israeli project. Of course, that was we had in mind the consequences of the Second World War and the debts that France had towards the Jewish community. So to repay our mistakes and crimes, we offered them a land in the Middle East, which was basically giving them a land that was not ours to give. And during the Algerian conflict, Israel was an ally to France, a colonialist ally, very important one. the idea was at the time to enclose the big Arab country that was supporting Algeria, so Egypt. So that's why France chose to support Israel at the time in the 50s. So I was talking about it a few times ago with a friend from Algeria who was and we said that very clearly France has a problem with its Jewish and Arab communities. We don't really know how to phrase that, but very clearly France has a problem with those two communities. And then I would add that more recently there is a new notion. Well, the notion is not really new, but it's now more present in the public discourse, and the secularity of the state. Now we have the impression that it's part of these three main values that we can see on our schools and public buildings. And there is this injunction that is more and more used as a tool to fight all religion. I'm personally atheist, but I'm not anti-religion. And we can see that there is an anti-religious movement at the moment, and there is, of course, one religion that is attacked more than the others, and that is Islam in France. And that's where we can see that the representations of Islam are full of errors. The Republican ideal is used against all those new cosmopolitans that are the Muslims, and the secularity of our state is used as a tool to hammer all those that we want to subdue. So I have the feeling that we have a fight to lead, and we need to remind everybody that the state needs to be secular, but not individuals, not the society, the civil society. Individuals can have many religions and beliefs. It's only the institutions, the national institutions, that need to be neutral when it comes to religion. But the order, the need to be now secular in our actions, that was brought about by Manuel Valls, really. Someone who even dared to utter words that border and even cross the border to racism. So this vision needs to make us reflect on the notion of secularity today in France. I just want to finish with two elements that are very important to me. They were mentioned this morning. So first, as Fabienne Messica was saying, we talked a lot about communities this morning. Esther Benbassa talked about the Jewish and Muslim communities, and I think that is a mistake. We should talk about community organizations, community spirit. Those are very real things, but I never met a community, neither Jewish community or Muslim community in France or anywhere else, but especially in France, because we are talking about the case here. So we can talk about community organization or even Israeli lobby, Likud lobby in France. That is something very tangible in France, but myself, I do not believe, I don't feel like I belong to a specific community. And I think that is the case for many people. The problem when we use the word community is that we are kind of, it's a performative act. The use of that word makes it self-fulfilling, people end up believing that they are part of the community. So this is a very problematic semantic meaning trap that we need to avoid. And second, that will be my conclusion. I don't really have any advice and recommendations to give you. Well, I don't have anything more to add on that front, but I want to stress that the links that are created between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism need to take into account the fact that many anti-Semitic people are pro-Zionist. And the quote by Ilana Levy reminded us of that. Anti-Zionism is fueled by anti-Semitism. And we need to add the fact that most of the Zionists in France, in the world, are not Jews and are anti-Semite. Or they at least use again and again some stereotypes which would be qualified as anti-Semite by if they were used by other people. For example, the Jews have the power, they control the press. For example, the American evangelists that are the reason why Trump made this decision about Jerusalem. So it's not very complicated to see all the anti-Semitic stereotypes when we listen to them more than 1 or 2 minutes. But just like umbrella salesmen are really use the rain, the anti-Semite can use Zionism as an argument. I don't really want to condemn someone because the person that comes to its help is problematic. I'm not Stalin, but we can. It's enough to look at all the people, the countries who support Israel today, or individuals who support Israel today. They are mainly from the far right. They come from organizations who have had horrific actions, or countries who have had horrific actions towards the Jewish community in the past 2 centuries. I work in the United Kingdom, in England, and I follow the situation there. And I noticed that the British far right, who have a wider, who can speak more freely than the far right in France because of the legislation. So these groups in Britain, in England, the far right anti-Semitic groups in England just wander the streets with flags of Israel and without anyone finding it weird. So we see that there are some links, some convergence on the political side. This creates a political framework in which all actors can position themselves. The far right is now has the power in Israel, and they create alliance with the far right in Europe and in the US. And I think that is something that we need to take into account when we think about this political situation. Thank you very much.